Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the National Press Club and to our traditional post-budget address by the Treasurer, Paul Keating. It's his lucky 13th appearance here today, and he's expanding on his 8th budget, and that's not counting the many mini-budgets and economic statements. So would you please welcome Paul Keating.
Well, thank you very much, Russell, and distinguished members of the National Press Club. Could I just say we have copies of the speech I'm about to make coming, so you'll be able to leaf through them soon, certainly before you leave. But could I thank you again for the invitation, and as always, I'm always pleased to be back. The first point I'd like to make would be basically a few introductory remarks about the budget and then perhaps invite questions. But on the first point I'd like to make is to discuss the quality of the fiscal policy decisions underlining last night's budget. As you're aware, of course, the budget brought down a surplus of $8.107 billion, equal to 2% of GDP. These days, such outcomes are considered by some as a little passé. So you'll forgive me for reminding you that this is not only the fourth successive budget surplus, but also the fourth ever. It is also the record budget surplus. Without question, the standards against which fiscal policy is judged have been established by this government. In last night's budget, further significant changes were made with significant out-year effects. As described in the budget papers, total net savings in this budget round amounted to $1016 million, exclusive of the debt transfer to the states. In other words, the core budget savings from ERC in the 1990-91 budget process were equal to more than $1 billion in net terms. This was not as clear from last night's document. What is not clear from last night's document is the very significant out-year effects of these savings. The Department of Finance estimates that measures next year will generate net savings of $1,600 million, followed by $1,900 million in 92-93 and $2,300 million by 1993-94. In other words, they are again quality savings decisions with significant long-term benefits. They fit firmly into the pattern of decisions made by this government over many years to correct the fiscal position of the Commonwealth for the long haul. A number of other budget decisions fit very much into the same category and may have been dismissed in some of the commentary too lightly. For instance, I regard the transfer of the debt to the states as a significant reform in its own right. To have the states borrowing explicitly on their own behalf presses upon them a discipline which they've not in the past been properly subject to. And of course they'll be independently rated as a result. The change to states' borrowings, while having an effect upon the Commonwealth budget surplus, has no effect whatsoever on the net PSBR, because some comment last night went to the point, well, it affects advantageously the Commonwealth budget surplus, but it doesn't affect at all the net PSBR, and yet that is still in balance. Informed public scrutiny is one of the key disciplines upon the public sector. It is something that we at the Commonwealth level accept to a degree unheard of before. I simply ask you to compare the comprehensiveness of yesterday's budget documents with what was provided before this government came to power. These budget documents not only include a detailed list of more than 400 government budget decisions, down to items costed at $100,000, but also the full year forward estimates of expenditure over the next 3 years and reconciliation table for decisions taken between budgets. In other words, there's a full set of, you can trace through decisions taken over the course of the year. The generalised budget figuring provided in John Howard's day barely deserves to be considered in the same breath. He did not even publish forward estimates, let alone commentary on the trends in the outlays. There was no pressure exerted on the Fraser government by the discipline of its budget documentation. Another decision in the budget, which is there for its long-haul effects, is the extension of the resource rent tax to Bass Strait. In essence, this decision will result in a more efficient and stable tax regime and will encourage greater recovery of reserves from Australia's major oil resource than would otherwise occur under the current excise system. The long-haul benefits of that are twofold. Not only a diminished dependency on imported product, but also increased revenue well excessing of $1 billion by the end of the decade, from the third year onwards of the new arrangements. However, the short-term cost is significant, $270 million in this budget and $410 million in the next. Given the pressures on this year's budget figuring, the easy thing for us to have done was simply to have put the decision off for another 12 months. In other words, made the surplus look bigger by $270 million by putting it off a year. But once again, it's a decision we took now because of its benefits to the community and the budget in the next decade. All this adds up to, as I said last night, a budget in which the outlay share as a percentage of GDP has been reduced to 23.5% and the revenue share has been reduced to 25.5%. From the point we have reached now, the critics calling for an even greater diminution in the size of the public sector can only be characterised as ideologues or John Birch-style zealots. The test is on these people to define what sort of public sector they want for Australia. They must describe which functions they believe the public sector should vacate. On the forward estimates incorporated in this budget, Commonwealth outlays as a proportion of GDP will be by 1993-94 will fall to only 21.6%. This is the lowest figure since 1960-61, 34 years previously. But even that figure understates the extent of the contraction in the public sector that has taken place since under this government. I say that because 1960-61 was actually a relatively low spending year by the standards of government at the time. In fact, in the earliest year for which comparative figures are kept, 1953-4, Commonwealth outlays as a percentage of GDP were 22.2%, only 1.3% less than in this financial year, and fully 0.6% more than what the forward estimates project for 1993-94. In other words, over a 40-year period, the Australian Commonwealth public sector, having climbed to a level as high as 30% of GDP, in less than a decade under this government will have been cut back to virtually the point where it began when Menzies returned to power nearly half a century ago. Yet some people who believe they offer considered comment say it should be smaller. Well, and this despite the enormous expansion in the variety of programs which the Commonwealth today provides, and I mentioned some of them yesterday: aged care, childcare, environmental programs, retention rates in schools, universities, etc. The difference has been achieved by the very rigorous targeting of government income support that this government has implemented over its 7.5 years in office. As you know, there were further significant extensions of that targeting last night. But seen in context, those measures represent the combination of a long-term process to more properly direct government spending to where it's needed. The point I'm making is that this achievement on the fiscal side demands of those who continue to call for an even smaller public sector some proper rationale for their argument. It's simply ludicrous to claim that another $500 million or so off the Commonwealth budget would make any difference to the attack on Australia's current account or allow a greater fall in interest rates than has already occurred. The Treasury itself debunks that view in Statement 2. The whole point of this massive shift in the public sector has been to vacate the market for domestic savings in order to reduce the call on overseas savings. The Commonwealth has applied a shift of 7 points of GDP in public sector borrowing demands to a problem on the current account equal to about 3.5% of GDP. That is, as a capital importing nation, Australia's current account has traditionally been at around 2.5% of GDP, and debt has been sustainable and stable at that level. The task has been to reduce it to that point from its recent high, which was of course approaching a cut of 6% of GDP. In essence, the Commonwealth has directly applied a policy shift to this problem of twice the magnitude of the imbalance. That is, the fiscal change is twice the size of the savings problem we are trying to correct, and it's why fiscal policy remains the central element of policy. In the event the solution is not proved that simple, An overblown public sector was not the only structural imbalance impacting on the current account. What has happened in the shorter term has been that as the public sector has vacated market savings, the private sector has stepped back in an effort to correct the structural weakness in investment that inflicted this country for 20 years. But that does not diminish the appropriateness of the government's response to the problem, which has been to pull the public sector back to the sort of levels it should have been maintained at in the first place. My point is that in the context of shifts in public sector demands equal to 7% of gross domestic product, around $30 billion a year in today's terms, calls for further savings at the margin are inane. They represent no more than an inability to see the wood for the trees. As for the opposition, they've responded to this budget by demanding even greater cuts in outlays. But the question of where they want the Australian public sector to end up must be addressed by them. The guilty party should be credited with no marks for a strident policy when it was incapable of exerting any fiscal discipline in office. Even before the latest budgetary efforts, OECD figures showed that the total Australian public sector was the fourth lowest amongst the developed countries of the world. International comparisons lag domestic developments, and there's every reason to think we are now pressing even further down that list. At the same time, as I pointed out last night, we are by world standards a low-tax country, the third lowest in the OECD. The reality is the opposition is now driven by extreme ideological considerations, which will soon make it as irrelevant as was the Federal Labor Party for most of the 1950s and 1960s. During that period, driven by ideological considerations over domestic and foreign policy, the Labor Party vacated the real business of public policy making to the coalition. After its fourth defeat in a row, the opposition is still thrashing around with its Box Hill obsession, the notion that it must go to a poll with a massive tax bribe. It has already come a cropper twice on that angle, and you will see it do the same again, because the Australian people are much better judges than the Liberal Party gives them credit for. Thank you for listening, and I'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Treasurer. We do now move to our usual period of questions from our media members, and I ask them as usual to state their name and that of their organisation. As usual, there are quite a number, and the Treasurer has to go at 10 to 2 to that other question time, so would you keep that in mind? The first question's from Michelle Grattan.
Michelle Grattan of The Age. Mr Keating, your budget flags a review of the wholesale sales tax system. Would it be open to that review to suggest the extension of indirect tax to some services, just some services, or is that entirely off your agenda for the rationalisation of the indirect tax system, as is a consumption tax?
Well, we put it off the agenda in that interregnum after the after the tax summit in 1985 and the tax statement of that year, because there was a lot of administrative and technical problems in trying to tax services and distinguish services from products, and for that reason we abandoned it. And I don't see that the review would take us back to it.
Julie Flynn.
Julie Flynn, Radio 2UE and 3AW Treasurer. Given the uncertainty created by the Middle East crisis, can we regard this budget as a holding budget, and can we expect an economic statement perhaps early next year? And if inflation does go up because of higher oil prices, could we expect to see a second round of tax cuts perhaps as part of that statement?
Well, I mean, if you're asking me, have we and should we have factored in a mini world war into the estimates, the answer is no, we didn't. And no, we shouldn't have.
Bob Bowden.
Bob Bowden, SBS Television, Mr Keating. The opposition's adoption of a consumption tax has thrown a new element into the economic debate. You mentioned that you expect them to go to the next election with the Box Hill bribe, I think you said. While you won't be offering tax cuts of that magnitude, do you expect that as we approach the election, the government can narrow the gap narrow the gap between the tax rates of the opposition and the government to such a point that makes a wholesale revamp or the introduction of a value-added tax or a goods and services tax unnecessary?
Well, it's unnecessary now. And that's the point I've made often. We are not dealing with the bloated public sector that Howard and Hewson left us. We're now down to a public sector of early 1970s size, and in 3 years' time we'll go to one of the early 1950s. Why then do we need another tax base? I think the difference between the government and the opposition is we've spent the last 2 months sitting around a table examining outlays and expenditures and programs to cut government spending. They spent the last 2 months dreaming up a new tax. And that is the difference between us. And if you give the political system another tax base when you have already cut the size of government spending back so that it can be financed by the current tax bases, then I don't think you advantage Australia at all. And given the fact now that it is impossible to compensate taxpayers and beneficiaries adequately and at the same time yield savings to cut marginal rates of tax, and it is impossible, as my last speech here made clear, and which no other correspondence directed towards it proved otherwise, that given the fact we've now got a much broader tax base than we had in 1985, to compensate it costs more money. The costs of compensation in the 1985 tax summit package were much smaller than what it would cost today because the tax base you are compensating is now much broader. So you cannot fully compensate and at the same time do anything other than cut the budget surplus. Now, if the Liberals say they believe they can do this without cutting the budget surplus and lower marginal rates of tax, all they will do is cut the top rate of tax by slugging low and middle income earners. So low and middle income earners will have a tax on their food and their clothing and their homes so as to cut the top marginal rate of tax. And that's what I call the Box Hill obsession. And all of this is supposed to be to have a single rate of tax on everything. If you look at the wholesale sales tax today, the great bulk of the money comes from one rate, 20%. The 20% rate, it's virtually a single rate tax now. The great bulk of the money comes from that one place. And so we're saying, oh, there's a virtue in having a single rate, which people say is less confusing, therefore it's less confusing to have, as the Liberals are apparently speaking now, 15% on your food or your clothing or your building materials. To have that, inverted commas, less confusing, you can all pay that price, and anyone who's got savings will have a one-off cut, a permanent cut in the value of their savings, particularly the aged. And those who've accumulated savings in the past and those who accumulate savings in the future. What? To reduce marginal rates of tax? To promote savings in the economy? No, because you can't reduce marginal rates of tax. Why? Why then, financing this very small public sector we've now got, as I said, the fourth lowest and travelling down, why then would you want another tax base in the tax system? And the answer is because they want to be seen to be doing something. And they're driven by an ideological view, and instead of coming up with policies that actually deal with our structural problems, what they want to do is come up with one which would blow our inflation rate to pieces. A 15% tax would add 7 percentage points to the inflation rate. Now, frankly, any mug can introduce a consumption tax. Anyone can. But taking the inflationary surge out of wages requires something much more clever. Now, I couldn't produce it in 1985, so I didn't wreck the place going on with it. And it's incumbent upon the Liberals to tell any one of us how they would take the 7 percentage points price surge out of inflation, how they could secure the agreement with the unions that I couldn't secure. And if they can't tell us, they shouldn't do it.
Mark Lever from AAP, Mr Keating. Your speech yesterday on the budget papers appeared to put a little more spotlight on inflation than perhaps in previous years. What do you regard as an acceptable level of inflation, and do you intend or hope to get us there in this term of government?
Well, given that the media of this country have become basically pamphleteers, that every time a government actually puts its hand up for a target, it gets torn to pieces if it doesn't achieve it. So I'm not setting any inflation targets. The inflation target that this government has is rolling around my cranium, and it's basically not going to be put in the marketplace against which the government's progress will be measured. I've said in the budget speech that we'll be reducing the gap with our trading partners, and we'll be doing that with one of the most robust monetary policies in the world, the tightest general government fiscal policy in the OECD, and one of the tightest overall public sector policies now, fiscal policies in the OECD, and a wage policy that came in 0.5 percentage point below forecast for the last financial year, ended a month or two ago. That's how we're going to deal with inflation.
Tom Burton from the Sydney Morning Herald. Mr Keating, as you know, the budget was going to contain a major statement on telecommunications reform until relatively recently. Last week, the entire contents of a Treasury Minute on telecommunications reform was published in the Thursday edition of the Financial Review. Did you authorise, indirectly or directly, the release of this document? Does the document now represent your preferred position for telecommunications reform? And if so, why have you switched your position from support for an OTC-led duopoly to an open competition at the network position?
Well, I'm not here to discuss telecommunication, I'm here to talk about the budget. But as you know, Tom, I don't share your view about telecommunications. Your view is the view that the only market that matters is the international market, where my view is the market which matters most is the domestic market, domestic competition, as well as the international market. And it is to that which the government has directed its interests. But the issues involved are complex, and there was really no possibility of us including decisions on that in this budget, and particularly notwithstanding the calling of a special conference of the Labor Party. So, leaving the conference to one side, had we decided to press on with telecommunication reform, we just simply couldn't have considered all of the issues that are bound up, all the structural issues, the technical issues which are bound up in that debate. It could not have basically come to the budget. Can I just make this point about the budget? Because the budget produced last night is a very tight fiscal outcome. It provides the record fiscal surplus in the history of the Federation. It's got outlays growth at 0.6% real, 1.1% on an adjusted basis, but adjusted for unemployment benefits, 0.1% real, against population growth of 1.6%. Now, I noticed in a piece Michelle wrote today, which was not an aggressive piece, but it said, I'm not saying it's a fair piece, but it wasn't an aggressive piece. But it said this, it said outlays show a modest real growth of 0.6%, not as good as in those years of zero increase. Well, that's right, but how many years does anybody believe? And this is part of the sort of simple view we're getting about budgets. This country's population is growing at about 1.5% a year. How many years do you think we can keep outlays negative or zero with that population growth? And it is there. So you've got a very tight fiscal outcome in the budget. But because the budget was not absolutely laden with structural issues, it is regarded by some of you as being passé, whereas at best these structural issues are slow burners for economic efficiency and the adjustment on the current account deficit. They are slow burners, and fiscal policy must remain the principal instrument of adjustment in the savings balance between our savings and those we rely upon abroad. And that's why it is trite to be attempting to paint the budget as being disappointing or passé, because it doesn't have the usual sprinkling, the usual cornucopia of goodies I've been able to provide you.
Steve Burrell.
Steve Burrell from the Financial Review, Treasurer. Many world wars aside, the budget strategy and the forecasts contained in Statement 2 appear to be based on a fairly benign view of how the Gulf crisis will affect the world economy and Australia. In particular, the budget forecasts are based very crucially on the assumption of a $23 US a barrel price for oil. Could I ask how you and the Treasury arrived at that figure, given that the price is now $3 or $4 higher, and most analysts are suggesting that it will stay at that level or go higher still?
Well, I don't know whether that's right. I know that most analysts do. There are huge stockpiles, much greater stockpiles than have ever existed in the past, particularly in some of the bigger countries such as Japan. We've already seen a lift in production in the British and Texas oil fields and the Gulf of New Mexico production. We are seeing Saudi Arabia talking about breaking with OPEC and lifting production. And at the time of the last oil price shock, which I said here yesterday, the 1980 oil price in today's dollars is $60 US. That happened when oil represented 5.5% of OECD GDP. It now represents 1.5%. Now that's point one. The other thing is that if the oil price went up, Australia would be a very great beneficiary of those price increases because it is a net energy exporter. It's not all bad news for Australia if the oil price does rise. We're close to self-sufficiency in oil, and unlike other countries, excuse me, higher oil prices and energy prices lead to real income gains for Australia, not losses. The impact on us, of course, would come from a slower world economy. But as ever, the markets have a better view of all this than the commentators. And it's probably no accident that events which are written as further bad news of Australia in the media have moved the Australian dollar up as the markets have made judgments about our currency as a commodity trader and an energy exporter. So, and at any rate, the exchange rate is therefore insulating us to an extent from the inflation consequences of higher oil prices. A higher exchange rate diminishes the inflationary impact of a higher world oil price. So all those things considered, as I said, short of factoring in a mini world war, which is now what some people are expecting the Treasury to do, they normally expect them to factor in terms of trade boosts that they can't see, world wars that might happen, but short of not factoring those things in, I think the assumptions are pretty solid.
Tom Ducevic.
Tom Ducevic from the Financial Review. Mr Keating, you were just mentioning the exchange rate. The $8 has continued to rise after the budget announcement. Given our inflation rate, this is bad news for the competitiveness of local producers.
Good news on inflation though, Tommy.
Are you concerned that a strong $8, Mr Keating, will threaten the budget assumption of strong net export growth this year?
No. I mean, I don't think we should be reacting to short-term movements in the exchange rate. What's going to produce the net exports is the decline in domestic demand and the fact that we're now got a higher level of investment, producing more product, more of the export, more of the traded goods, more in the traded goods area of the economy, more of the export variety, and it's that decline in that zero G&E which is going to be lifting net exports for us. And that's why it is important to have a tight fiscal and monetary policy in place, which we have got. Now, sure, there are effects, competitive effects coming from the exchange rate, but these will adjust over time. I mean, in Statement 2, the Treasury has some commentary on fears about competitiveness being expressed in terms of central bank interventions in 1970, 87 and 88. And what they did basically was try and swim against the tide of a pickup in the terms of trade. I mean, the market got it right again. And those interventions only pumped the money base along and in the end made it harder to control the aggregates. So, you know, it may be cautious and prudent to point to these things, but not particularly wise in trying to alter them.
Stephen Wright.
Steve Wright from the Melbourne Sun, Mr Treasurer. You were quoted in the election campaign as saying you look forward to the day when you could deliver the good news and become the nice guy of politics. Do you think that that vision is sort of slipping away from you? Secondly, I presume you would reject the sort of term collywobbles if it was used to describe the government at the moment. But what will you be telling the team you've adopted in the AFL when you go down there on Friday, since they've lost 3 out of the last 4?
Well, I've told them I've already won one grand final this year, or been involved in the winning grand final team this year, which makes a lot of this commentary more bearable, I might say. And I'll say to them that they might have been a little tired by the match with Essendon, which made Essendon tired, obviously, because they lost the following week, to Carlton, which Collingwood beat the week I was there. So they're still number 2, and there's still a chance for the flag. Now, the reason we're a better than even chance for the flag at the next grand final of ours is that we'll get the current account deficit down further. And this 1 percentage point reduction in the current account to GDP is a very significant change. And one of the things is maintaining this tight fiscal policy. But let me just pick up this point about tight fiscal policy and reiterate the points I made in the speech. Isn't it about time we heard from the people who attack fiscal policy when we've got it heading to 1950s levels as to what sort of public sector they believe there should be? Now, we had Ross Gittins today in the Sydney Morning Herald saying that I no longer had the strength to put the budget where I know it ought to go. Well, where do I know it ought to go? Where do I know it ought to go? I mean, I noticed the Treasury said actually Max picked this up, dear old Max. He said in his piece, I must send this to Ross. He said, the Treasury observes, recent calls for modestly tighter fiscal policy as a means of providing scope for a significant relaxation of monetary policy appear misjudged against that earlier experience. In other words, here's the Treasury saying it's bunkum. But here's dear old Ross saying, I should go where I know I ought to go, when my department's saying, quite obviously, any marginal going further will do nothing for monetary policy or anything whatsoever. And then my dear friend Paddy, not that I'm going to take advantage of your presence, which is a rare privilege for me, but to just say this, you said, in other words, we are left with a decidedly flaccid principal arm of economic policy. Well, I can only say to you that with the record budget surplus and 0.6% real growth, if that doesn't defy the description of flaccid, I don't know what does. Now, I don't object to commentators putting views about these things, but I think we are at the point where those who believe that we ought to have a much tighter fiscal policy than we have, that is, that all of those measures that we were involved with last night, pharmaceuticals, assets testing family allowances, faster repayments on HECS, things of that variety, that if we are to go even further to the bone and get into those outlays programs, we've got to say, what sort of society do we want? Do we sort of want a Reagan-esque society where you huddle over a railway grate to keep warm, while the billionaires fly around in their planes with their own name slapped down the side? I mean, or their buildings with the name across the top? I mean, is that the sort of society Australians want after all of these years? I mean, I thought we'd done it better by getting a decent balance between social policy and economic policy. But that balance is not enough for many people, including the opposition, who are now saying they want a much tighter fiscal policy. In other words, they believe in 1990 we should have a public sector smaller than 1950, but providing the services which they believe are now called for, childcare, aged care, environmental programs and the rest, while at the same time giving the rich a further tax cut. Not only those who incorporate enjoy a 39% tax rate now, but they believe the top marginal rate should be cut well below 47%, but while not cutting anybody else's rate. I mean, does anybody here believe they're the sort of kind of policies that will hold this country together when it faces one of its longest structural adjustments? And it will face a long structural adjustment, getting the current account deficit down. And you want to face it adding 7 percentage points to the price system with a consumption tax, trying to badger the unions to cut it out of wages while you rip away at the social wage. I mean, the whole pack of cards would come down. And the problem I think a lot of commentators have, it's because the government has been here 7 years, and I have delivered 15 statements, that they're not looking for better policy, they're just looking basically for new personalities. They're not really seriously interested in national issues, they're after new people. But God help us if we get the kind of people that gave us the problem in the first place.
Bruce Juddery.
Mr Keating, Bruce Juddery from Australian Business. I've no problem however long you want to stay there, Mr Keating.
Good on you, Bruce. I always had worries about you at the ballot box, but now you've come clean.
Have a word with Ros Kelly and check my political credentials if you want to.
Well, in that case, I will give you more exclusives than I've given you to date.
Exactly, zilch, and your tape recorder didn't work either.
I know. We'll repair that problem.
You've been doing a little bit of press thumping today on the subject of this record surplus that's coming in. As I recall, the surplus of the year immediately past, a year ago when you appeared here, was going to be rather larger than it was. Is there any reason for us to believe that you won't perform again short of your own expectations? You've posited a lot of your budget on $23 US dollars oil tax. That looks as though it could be, as one of your predecessors once said, rubbery.
Well, oily.
There are some
might be better.
greasy, slippery. There are assumptions about exports which depend on international demand being maintained. Aren't you really giving us a lot of rubbery figures, greasy, oily, slippery figures, and just how far could we take them seriously?
Well, look, Bruce, as I said to you earlier, these are the Rolls-Royce of budget documents in the OECD. Right? That's the most comprehensive quality set of budget documents in the OECD area. You ought to go and have a look at a Canadian set of budget documents. They have a copy of the photograph of the Prime Minister, a couple of charts. It looks like a brochure for a new car. This is a set of real documents. And if you don't believe, look, we've brought these surpluses in above the forecast often, and the deficits have come in lower than the forecast. Last year, part of the reason why the surplus came in low is because the Senate wouldn't pass a bill. That was $500 million. So there's half a billion of the $1 billion difference. And the other was just slower receipts and bigger outlays in the latter part of the year. That's why. And this year, but as I say, this year's projected surplus is larger than last year's outcome, and therefore this year's projected surplus is the Australian record. And so I don't think that we've got unemployment rising there. It's not the record forecast, no. But that doesn't matter. It's the outcomes that matter, and there are no easy assumptions here. As I said, short of being required to factor in a world war, which I think is entirely unreasonable, that we A, should have one in the first place, and B, factor it in, what else can we do but make the best judgment we can make about the oil price? And the Treasury spent a lot of time looking at that issue. But if we'd have overestimated the oil price, the question today would have been, Treasury, you've got a very high oil price in here, does that mean your revenue assumptions are rubbery? So you can't win, mate, in this game. You can't win in this.
Laurie Wilson.
Treasurer Laurie Wilson, in terms of the deeming arrangements for interest payments on pensioners' bank accounts, how would you feel about a non-bank financial instrument which perhaps offered, similar to low start repayment home loans, a low start yield but which increased over time to protect benefits? Or how would you feel perhaps about, would you recommend that pensioners perhaps should simply take their money out of the bank if they're faced with this prospect and invest it in the stock market, where they'd no doubt get a low yield in dividend terms, probably franked anyway, and effectively defer their tax liability downstream in terms of capital gains? Would you perhaps suggest that maybe they should simply put it in high interest rate bank accounts and give the bulk of it away to charities? And why shouldn't people be allowed to do what they want with their money? I mean, they can't even take it out of the bank and put it under the bed to conjure up images of Malcolm Fraser.
Well, look, Laurie, it's not a matter of people not being able to do what they want with their money. It's a case of a set of institutions basically taking advantage of people who are not aware that they can earn more, because they think there's some problem about the conditions and access to those accounts. And what that means is that it's allowed many middle-income people and high-income people to wander along to the bank to get a mortgage or a commercial loan, which is advantaged by the fact that a pensioner is lending his or her money for either nothing or 4%. Now, basically, this encourages the banking system to pay them a decent interest rate. And it will mean for many pensioners, because there is now no tax on full rate pensioners, a higher not after tax, but a higher income after the free area, the withdrawal on the pension in the free area, and after they've earned the interest. They'd be actually better off in a higher interest account than they would trying to do as they think they're doing, that is, keep all the pension and not earn the interest. They're actually better off, often, and they will be under this standard, better off earning more interest income, even if it did mean they'd lose $1 or $2 of pension. Now, the fact is, a single pensioner can earn $40 and a married pensioner $60-something, I can't remember exactly, $60-odd before they lose $1 of pension. There's no tax on them because they're now outside the tax system. So why should they be supporting the rest of us, lending the rest of us money at 0 or 4%? And that's the issue. Pensioners will be better off as a result of this change.
Laura Tingle.
Laura Tingle from The Australian. Mr Keating, you've asked us to look at the quality of the fiscal policy position today, and you've also pointed out that the net PSBR in this year's budget is 0. The word from both the Treasury and the Reserve Bank and from yourself is that fiscal policy is now a medium-term instrument for dealing with the savings issue. Does that mean that in the medium term a net PSBR of 0 is the target you'll be looking for? No. And what happens if the states don't meet their own deficits this year or the situation deteriorates? Will your goal still be a net PSBR of 0 for this year if you have to change your arrangements?
No, but we've made the most close-in judgment we've ever made about the states' recurrent budgets. There's been much more contact between the Federal Treasury and the state treasuries this year about their recurrent budgets, and the squeeze on the states coming from the Loan Council for a number of successive years has produced a qualitative change in the thinking of state treasuries. They're now actually thinking about cutting back services, where before they were cutting capital. They're now actually thinking about cutting services, which we've been doing for years. So we're probably likely this year to get a much tighter definition on the state's recurrent position, and hence be able to estimate the net PSBR much more closely than we've ever been able to estimate it. But, I mean, in a lot of your comment lately, you get hooked up on this medium-term issue, you know, about whether things are targets and medium-term targets. Fiscal policy is the principal instrument of adjustment of the current account deficit and the change in the savings balance of Australia. That's what it is. It's the thing which changes the structural balance in part. The tax system's there, wages, competitiveness, all the other issues are there, but that building block is on fiscal policy. But it doesn't mean that the government's going to be bound up to numbers over a period of time. We've always been more ambitious, in fact, than any target we would have been likely to adopt. we've been far more ambitious. You know, if we'd have adopted getting the Commonwealth budget into balance, that could have been a reasonable target in 1985-6. We've got it into a surplus of 2% of GDP today. I mean, we've been far more ambitious than any target we would have set ourselves. And why be clod hopping around with targets? Now, I mean, it's targets are for people who don't trust their own judgments, who don't trust themselves. We're not in that lamentable position yet.
Amanda Buckley.
Amanda Buckley from the Daily Telegraph. Mr Keating, you've put off a decision on telecom and the airlines until after the party meeting, but the Treasury had a lot to say in the documents about the need for microeconomic reform. And I'm wondering, is that the sort of message you'd like the ALP to take into account in the lead-up to the conference? And secondly, Bob Hawke has talked about spending the money from asset sales on a railroad program, a big rejigging of the railroad freight program. Do you support that, and could we have your comments on it?
Well, there is no definition to that policy yet, no real definition to that. Rail is one of those topics which we've got to address. But I certainly wouldn't be supporting a policy of spending asset sales proceeds in their entirety simply to please or to meet some of the more ordinary aspirations of some of our constituency within the Labor Party. So that's a subject which will have to be thought about. But in terms of any Treasury comment and statement 2, as you know, the budget papers in the end go out under my name, and there's not a word in statement 2 I haven't read. And if it's there, I endorse it. And I endorse everything that's said about microeconomic policy. It's important in making the economy more supple and flexible. But they are, as I said earlier, they're slow burners. And if we relied on those things only to change the current account balance, we would never change it. That's why fiscal policy is so important, and why I think it's been wrong of commentators to regard a most ambitious fiscal outcome like this one as passé. You know, as I've said to you before, you've all lived through a period of enormous change in the last 7 years, and I don't even attempt to disparage any of you by saying that to some extent it spoiled you compared to what used to come from the... I can remember a time here in the 70s when a lot of members of bureaus wouldn't see a press statement from the government in weeks, and then it would be to appoint someone to the second repatriation tribunal or something, and where a lot of press carrier time was spent on the squash courts. I mean, this has been a policy revolution from 1983, and because this budget hasn't got all the micro statements in it, you're saying, oh, well, it's pretty ordinary, hasn't got all the micro statements in it, but we'll be doing those things later in the year. But again, they will be important but slow burners for the economy.
We've got 2 questions to go, see if we can get them in before the Treasurer must go. David Barnett.
David Barnett from the Bulletin Treasurer. You did in fact allow in your budget statement for the possibility of oil prices racing up, and you said that if that happens, the question of the accord and the projected wages outcome for the year of 7% would be something that could be reconsidered. Why should this be so? Why should this one section of the community be insulated from the effect of an oil price increase? Why shouldn't that sort of thing be something that falls evenly over the whole community? In fact, if the trade union or people covered by awards are to be protected from the impact of higher oil prices, that in itself will transfer the burden that might fall on them to everybody else.
David, if there was a dramatic change, as we say in the text, and $60 was the oil shock, the second oil shock price in today's terms, if there was something dramatic happening, then of course we would have to go back and look at these things. We've said that. But there's always a sort of determination on the part of many of you going, let's go and chop the unions again. Look, they've taken, for the ACTU constituency, 4.5% to 5% a year over these years. For for AWE outcomes of 6 and 6.5. But in that 6 and 6.5 are all the top end of town. All the executives, the managing directors who have had salary increases, sometimes of 150 or 200%. All of the information sector, if I could be that pointed, certainly most of the services sector, definitely the most of the financial services sector, have all been hopped in for their chop. The Cullen, Egan and Dell is looking at international comparability on salaries, comparative wage justice for the top end of town, but if you happen to be in the ACTU's constituency, 4.5 or 5% will do you. Now that's where those 6.5% AWE numbers have come from. Yesterday we had David Love in that press conference frothing at the mouth about 6.5% outcomes. But I never ever read any of his texts frothing at the mouth about executive salaries or about the earnings of the managerial groups in this country. Never once. The ACTU bobs up year in, year out, picks up something around 4 to 5%, and everyone wants to get into them and kick them to death again. We've now got a profit share greater than any time in the nation's history, this very day. This very day. And a wage share and GDP back at 1950s levels. What do you want to do to them? I mean, there was a talk in the 70s about the real wage overhang, which I think an expression which Paddy promoted, which was correct at the time, and we dealt with that. We're not the real wage overhang out. But does anyone talk about the real profits overhang, which has punched our inflation rate along? Does anyone talk about winding down profits to cut prices to reduce inflation? No, it's only about cutting wages of the ACTU constituency. And that's the same kind of intemperate sort of view that's inherent in your question, David. Let's before even the oil price gets up, let's get them in and sock it to them again. This wage agreement has a 1.5% through the year extra cost above the pipeline. Now, does any one of you think that you'd get the national constituencies of the union movement in and say, we're going to actually draw from you a better arrangement than that? Now, these are impossibilities. Impossibilities. You know what would have happened in 1987, 88, 89, in a period of a huge demand, that huge demand bout? We would have had wages running at 15 to 20%, and the inflation rate would now be well into double digits without the accord. That's the position. And that was exactly the position with the executive salaries and the managerial groups. Exactly the position. But no one wants to talk about them. They're all sitting on their... All these people in banks who are always lecturing us are sitting on $600,000 and $700,000 salaries. You know, the biggest industrial companies, 1, 2 and 3 million for their chief executive officers. And the slaves are getting 4.5% or 5% through the years. Get them in and whack them again. Well, the fact is, I bloody well won't. And that's it, I won't. Now it's time for me to leave. Thank you very much.
Thanks again, Treasurer. I want to point out that this is the Rolls-Royce of books. It collects 21 of the speeches made at this club over the past 27 years. Regrettably, it doesn't have one of yours. But in the
case, I'll leave it as a complimentary copy for someone else.
Oh, in the next edition, you'll have to keep coming back. Certainly, you'll get in there. Thanks very much for coming.